All right, moving on to our next PowerPoint on the Age of Absolutism, continuing with Eastern Europe. We are going to move into Prussia. And the family that ruled in Prussia is known as the Hohenzollern. That is how you say that last name, the Hohenzollern. Now, before you go any further, I want you to please click on this link. The link is in the description, by the way, and watch Tom Ritchie's video on Prussian absolutism. He is going to give you a very good, solid foundation, and I might be able to add some things that he does not mention, but he's mainly going to talk about the first Frederick William that you need to know about. And notice what I have on my little note here. Please give me a one-page summary. Some of you have been turning in summaries that are very, very lazy and only 1 or 2 sentences. That does not indicate that you learned anything. This basically, you're taking notes on the video, showing me that you remember what you've learned. So please, don't be lazy. Stop this video, watch that video, and then come back to this one. All right, welcome back. As we know that the 30 Years' War devastated the German-speaking lands. They had suffered greatly. We talked about how many people died. The villages were burned down by several countries. And so it's going to take a very long time for Germany and the German lands to try to recover from that war. Prussia, as we saw in our map from the PowerPoint from yesterday, lay just outside of the Holy Roman Empire, and many people saw it as a meaningless territory. And the reason for that ultimately is because it did not really have a lot of resources, as was mentioned. Frederick William at the time was able to organize Prussia, however, into a unified nation and established what is going to become known as the Hohenzollern dynasty. Now, I know I have the word king up there, but ultimately I wouldn't know if we'd call him a king. It was more like he was the local ruler of that particular German land. But later on, the Hohenzollerns do wind up gaining independence from the Holy Roman Empire, so yeah, I guess we could call him a king. Now, Frederick was the nephew of the King of Sweden, and his wife was the granddaughter of William of Orange. So again, just showing you guys how these families were all connected in some way. He was very well educated, and that is important to understand how he was able to make Prussia into a great power. Education was an important part of Prussian history, as you would have seen from Tom Ritchie's video. He was a strict Calvinist. He did, however, allow Catholics and Jews to worship freely in Prussia. Not as much as maybe he allowed Calvinists and Lutherans, but that is one thing that we can say about the Prussians, is that they allowed for religious freedom. And that is one of the reasons why they became so successful, because people wouldn't revolt if they were allowed to worship as they wanted. He was known as the Great Elector. That is the term that he was given. And one of the things that he was able to establish was the city of Berlin. This became his capital city, and he allowed for 20,000 French Huguenots to immigrate there. Now, why would French Huguenots need to immigrate to Berlin? Well, as you remember, Louis XIV had eradicated or revoked the Edict of Nantes, and so many of those Huguenots needed to leave France, and in doing so, this is where they were able to seek religious solitude. His greatest victory, however, was being able to develop a professional army. They were not mercenaries. A mercenary is a hired soldier, and so instead of hiring soldiers from maybe outside lands or something like that, he was able to get people to join the army from within. And so that meant that people were going to be loyal to him. And Prussia, that's pretty much what it's going to be known for, is its military. Frederick William died, and he was replaced with his son, Frederick I. Unlike his father, however, Frederick I was actually pretty weak. He really didn't do a lot that his father had done for the last 25 years. And so he's not going to be one of the grand rulers of Prussia, that's for sure. And so he was later replaced by his son, Frederick William I. So we're kind of just skip a generation here. So Frederick William I is Frederick William's grandson, and he becomes a very strong ruler. He was obsessed with the military, and therefore he is going to be nicknamed the Soldier King. And this is the ruler that you watched during Tom Ritchie's video. So we're going to spend some time on him for a little bit. Here's a picture of him in his Prussian uniform. So under him, the Prussian military was able to double in size. Now, this is going to consume a large portion of the national budget. So you can see a little bit more why Frederick William wanted Silesia, so that he could get the resources to try to help the Prussian economy. But he really saw this as necessary because Prussia was otherwise considered useless to the rest of the Holy Roman Empire. So he wanted to make sure that he was able to put himself on the map. And he did so by building a strong military. However, he was able to economically try to balance the budget a little bit by what he did not have the same lavishness or extravagance of rulers such as Louis XIV. And he also started to tax the nobles. And so this is something that was unheard of in most countries, but he cut a lot of these expenses and was able to not allow Prussia to go bankrupt just by paying for a military. So the army was molded into one of the most absolute in terms of obedience and discipline. They were very, very strict. They were pretty much known for being a very strong and powerful and successful military. Frederick William's greatest fear, though, was that his son would not be strong enough to rule, because just like his father, he started to notice that Frederick II was not necessarily really taking the same interest that he did when he was a child. He loved music, he loved philosophy, he loved poetry. I guess you could say he didn't really love the military, which is ultimately what his father had hoped for. And so as a result, Frederick was not a nice person, and he would constantly beat his son. And he would also humiliate him because he didn't have the same interests. Just one example, in 1730, his son ran away from home and he attempted to move to England. He was caught by his father. His father probably sent out people to get him for him. And as punishment, Frederick forced his son to watch his best friend beheaded. So this just kind of shows you the type of father that he was. Very strict, and wanted his son to grow up the same way. So it was at this particular time that Frederick suggested to his father that he be married to Maria Theresa. And so Maria Theresa, who we just learned about in the previous PowerPoint, and so he thought that that would actually be a really good alliance between Prussia and Austria, but instead he was just simply married to a German princess. Frederick II took power at the age of 28, and this was only 6 months after Maria Theresa also came to power. So they pretty much were able to take the throne about the same time. After taking power, he decided to begin the War of Austrian Succession, which we learned about in the other PowerPoint. And so his whole goal, obviously, was to try to remove Maria Theresa from power. So really, his father's strict guidelines had wound up creating him into a pretty strong and powerful ruler. Of course, we know that it was a failure for Prussia. He was not able to take the throne of Austria. He was not able to remove Maria Theresa from power, so he started to rework his military strategy. At the same time, though, remember, he had a very strong love of learning, and so he started studying French philosophy and also studying the works of Machiavelli. And so this is what is going to give him also the title of enlightened despot. And so he came to the conclusion by reading Machiavelli that people obviously are naturally wicked and are incorrect, and therefore they need strong rulership to try to control them. But he did believe, though, that people were both good and bad. He didn't 100% follow the teachings of Machiavelli, but instead he did see some good in people. He also said that a ruler existed for the benefit of the nation, not the other way around, as Machiavelli had argued. he didn't say that the benefit of the nation came from the ruler, but the ruler actually is the one who needs to help make sure that the nation can be benefited. So we know that in the War of Austrian Succession, he actually watched in horror as Maria Theresa allied Austria with France, Sweden, and Russia. He did not expect this to happen. So he was only able to form an alliance with Great Britain, but he decided it was better to fight his enemies now than wait for later. And this is something that nobody really ever saw coming, because what stake did Great Britain have in any of this? So Russia wound up launching a series of battles against Russia, Austria, and France, and this began what we know as the 7 Years' War. Now, you're going to read a little bit more about this in your book. It'll give you some more details, but this is a very important time and a very important war in European history. Britain and France wound up fighting each other mainly on the New World, and you guys might be familiar with this, known as the French and Indian War. However, the war taking place in America was in Europe was known as the 7 Years' War. So while England and France were fighting each other in America, Frederick was struggling to try to maintain power against three very powerful enemies of Russia, Austria, and Sweden. So amazingly, Frederick often fought in these battles himself personally. Remember, we had mentioned that he didn't really have a strong love of the military, but I guess his father beat it into him, so to speak, and he became a very strong and powerful military leader. He even had 6 horses shot from under him during battles. He wound up innovating and creating many new battle strategies and different battle techniques and formations. And so he was actually considered to be a military genius, which is interesting considering it was something he wasn't initially interested in. And despite being outnumbered 10-1 in the 7 Years' War, Prussia wound up holding its own. And a large part of this was due to the fact that Frederick was a military genius. Even Napoleon, as we get to learn about him later on in this quarter, he too considered Frederick to be the greatest military genius of all time. At first, the 7 Years' War actually went really well for Frederick, and his armies, in fact, were winning for the most part. But as the years passed, Austria and Russia were able to fight their way towards Berlin, and it looked as though that Frederick and his armies were going to be defeated. However, it was at this moment that an interesting miracle saved Prussia and Frederick II from complete destruction. Now, what I'm doing right now is whetting your appetite. I'm not going to tell you what that miracle was, but we will learn about it when we discuss Russia. But if you want to go ahead and do some research, look up the miracle of Brandenburg, and you might find some interesting details. So the 7 Years' War was ended with the Treaty of Paris. This was signed in 1763, and many people consider this to be the worst European war of the 18th century. Winston Churchill actually even called it the first real world war. And the reason for that is because not only were so many people killed, but also so many different countries were involved. The alliances that were formed, and then of course the fact that it was also fought on a completely different continent as well. So what were the expenses of the war? Well, first of all, France lost all of its American colonies. They were given to Britain. Prussia, however, was able to reestablish itself as a great power, and they returned to where they were as a status before the war had started. So Prussia certainly had put themselves on the map, and people realized they were not somebody to be messed with. However, this did not deter Frederick II from going into several other wars. So as a military genius, he fought in more than just the 7 Years' War and the War of Austrian Succession. these wars later went on to expand Prussia's power. So very strategic and important for Prussia to become powerful. So if you would like to watch a video on the 7 Years' War, it's just mentioned in about 3 minutes. There's no assignment with this video. Just kind of gives you a little bit of who was on whose side and why, and the outcomes as well. So while fighting bravely in battle, Frederick also was able to reform the government of Prussia. So not only was he a powerful military leader, a powerful king, but an absolute ruler at that, and an enlightened absolute ruler. He could speak 10 languages, including Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, which at this point are pretty much considered to be dead languages, and so it was pretty remarkable that he could continue to speak them. He brought Prussia into a wealth of new ideas, and as I mentioned, he too is considered to be an enlightened despot. He read very much from the philosophers of the Enlightenment time period, such as Voltaire and Montesquieu, and so by reading their ideas, this is really what helped him have an open mind when ruling over Prussia. He too, like Louis XIV, also wanted to continue with great building projects, and so he built opera houses, because remember, he had a very strong love of music and poetry. So he built opera houses, libraries, universities, and many palaces in Prussia as well. So Prussia went really from being a backwards German nation to what many people thought was completely useless, but under Frederick, who later becomes known as Frederick the Great, it becomes one of the most educated places on earth. He completely also was able to overhaul the entire economic and agricultural systems, because remember, they didn't really have good land for harvesting, and it was very difficult for them to get natural resources, but he was able to create irrigation systems and all sorts of ways for them to become an economic powerhouse. But most importantly, he was able to have Berlin completely redesigned. And so he probably took note of Versailles by Louis in Paris and said that he wanted to do something similar. And so he went and completely redesigned the city of Berlin. And so a lot of people were very envious of what he was able to accomplish. He also found time to compose over 100 sonatas and 4 symphonies. So his love for music was very, very clear. All of these things are what gave him the title of Frederick the Great, also known as the Soldier King. His final goal, however, was to try to conquest Poland and Lithuania, and that's because of its location, and this is actually going to be a constant battle between Russia and Austria and Prussia as well. So poor Poland. Poland, unfortunately, was not a very powerful nation. They did not have a strong central ruler. And so Frederick saw this as an advantage to try to take it over. And so what's interesting is he actually wound up becoming allies with Sweden, Austria, and Russia, which is ironic because these are the exact same nations that he fought against in the 7 Years' War. But they wound up forming an alliance, and very quickly they were able to take Lithuania and Poland. And so as a result, for a very long time, Poland and Lithuania were not free nations. This is known as the Partition of Poland, which you will also read about in your book. And here you can see from this map, Poland was actually partitioned several different times. Poor Poland, they just really kind of get the brunt end of it a lot in European history. But you can see Russia was able to acquire lands in several different years. Prussia acquired everything in yellow for several different years, and Austria acquired what you see in purple. So at the age of 74, which yes is a pretty old age considering, Frederick the Great died. He was able to rule Prussia for 46 years. Then the throne passed on to his nephew, which is Frederick William II. So even though Prussia was now a major new power on the map, certainly one that Europe had to be careful of, An older and larger power to the east, also known as Russia, was also about to reach new heights of power. And that's going to be our next PowerPoint. We're actually going to spend quite a bit of time on Russia, learning about its early rulers with Ivan the Terrible and winding up with Catherine the Great. That's it for tonight. See you next time.